YouTube, Sidekick here. Today we have a first look and review of the latest in the Famous Flyers series for Microsoft Flight Simulator by Carenado and Microsoft, and that, of course, is the Beechcraft Bonanza V35. Now, the V35 is an interesting choice because, of course, we already have a Bonanza in the base Microsoft Flight Simulator game, and that's the G36 model. So, a topic we should really deal with is why you would want to invest some of your hard-earned cash in another version of an aircraft you already get for free. Let's talk about that in a sec once we get the aircraft started up here. We're just going through all the usual checks. We're going to make sure the prop is full forward. Make sure the mixture is full rich. And we're not going to need to worry about that handle. And we're going to make sure our parking brake is on. We don't need the cowl flaps closed at this point. Flaps are up. So let's just go over and start our electrics over here. First we'll get the light on. Get the battery and the generator on. Take a look around. Clear prop. And get the engine fired up. And it starts just like that. And then we're just going to have to turn the master avionics switch on over by the Garmin there. And we will be ready to go. Right there. There it is. Alright, just making sure all of the instruments are reading in the right kind of zones here. Good engine instruments. Oil temperatures are good. We don't want to start out until we're warm enough. And we'll close the window. And we'll start our taxi. We are at the Oshawa Executive Airport this morning, and we're going to take a little trip down to the Big Smoke, down to Toronto, to the Billy Bishop Toronto Island Airport. We're just going to get ourselves started here, checking to make sure the controls are free and clear. And I think we're just about ready to taxi. Find the parking brake there, and we'll get underway. So, as I said, the first topic to deal with in talking about the V35 is why you would bother spending, it's not a lot of money, but it's a little bit of money, to get the V35 when you already have the G36, which is essentially the same airframe and I think even the same engine. So the answer is that while it's true that the V35 is very similar to the G36, it does look and feel very different, and maybe in some ways that might be of interest to you, as they were to me. The other part of the answer, honestly, is that at $15, it's not really a very significant investment. But before going on to the story of the Bonanza, and there is quite a story to tell since it has been in production for almost 75 years, making it the general aviation aircraft with the longest production history ever. Let's take a look at how the V35 looks and feels in the sim. You saw we got in the aircraft and got it started up. Now we're just taxiing down to the runway. Let me first say that my overall impression of the V35, that it is another very competent job by Carenado, which really seems to have developed a facility for making cheap and cheerful products, let's call them. They may lack a lot of the fine details that true aficionados may be looking for, but they are designed and priced to appeal to a very wide audience, I think. As you could see in the intro, the outside texturing and the liveries are competent. There's really no complaints there. There's enough detail. All of the moving parts that should move do. As far as the cockpit experience is concerned, all of the functions are present, as you've seen, including doors and windows. All of the switches and the systems that are needed to operate the aircraft are present and functional. Whether their functioning is completely high fidelity is maybe another question, but not one I'm really competent to answer. The internal texturing is okay, as is the sound model. Both are a little uninspired. There's not a whole lot of fine details. And that just makes the V35 experience, I think, at least moderately authentic, although maybe a little bit short of truly immersive. So we're just getting ready to do the run-up checks here. Checking to make sure that our flaps actually work. We can hear them going, and we can see them going out there. And so this is what I would mean by the the sound model. The sound model, you certainly hear the motor running, you hear the flaps moving. In the air, you'll hear the difference that the airflow makes, but there's no kind of clunk, there's no chunk, there's none of those details that really add to the immersion in the sim. But as I said, for the price, that's maybe pretty reasonable. Okay, so we're just going through the run-up check here. We're going to run it up to about 1700 RPM. And then we're just going to check our engine temps and pressures. And then we're going to pull the RPMs back and just make sure that we actually have control of the propeller RPM, and we do. So let's put it back up to full power. And let's get ready to head out to the runway. Okay, we're taking off on runway 30 today, so we're just going to roll ourselves out there. And we'll take off, and after we've climbed out, we're going to head generally west towards Toronto, and along the way we'll ring things out a little bit and just see how it flies. Now, one thing you'll note when flying the V-35 is that it does require a fair bit of rudder on takeoff, which I guess is a good thing. That probably says something for the fidelity of the flight model. Just going to set the heading bug here so I can make sure I can stay on the runway heading after we take off. And final checks. And I think we are ready to go. So we're going to rotate it around 70 miles an hour. Brakes off, and down the runway we go. As I said, you do need a fair bit of work on the rudder pedals to keep it straight. And the takeoff roll is not really all that short. And we're nearly there. Rotation. And we're off. And we'll bring the gear up. Build up the speed here to about 90, 95, and then we'll climb out at 90 or 95 knots. One thing to note is that the airspeed indicator is in knots, not in miles per hour. So, as I was saying, what's the difference in the experience between the V-35 and the G36? And I'm sure you can see most of it by now, even with the time we've spent in the cockpit. And this is an aircraft that is definitely aimed at the steam gauge crowd. The biggest difference between the V-35 and the G36 is really that the V-35 evokes a very 1970s vibe, whereas the G36 is very much a fully modern cockpit. The V-35 was first produced in 1972, so it's not surprising that it really does feel like you're stepping back into 1970s, including with the wood paneling on the dash and the cockpit. And the gauges are the good old-fashioned steam versions. It does have an autopilot, and technically it's a digital autopilot. But it's more advanced than the systems like, say, in the Grumman Goose or the Beech 18, but it is very much redolent of the 1970s, let's just say, and I speak as one who was there. In terms of overall performance, there's not a whole lot to choose between the G36 and the V-35. They're both low-wing, retractable nose wheel gears we've seen. They both have constant speed props. They're both fairly high performance, being able to cruise at more than 150 knots. And they have a decent amount of flap, which gives you moderate takeoff and landing speeds, so they're designed to get in and out of most municipal and regional airports. They have enough nav avionics to handle IFR approaches if that's what you want to do, but in the sim I think they're mostly going to be a good choice for mostly VFR touring, as an aircraft that has enough speed to keep things interesting, but not a lot of complicated systems that need to be mastered. Now, whether you prefer the V-35 or the G36 is really going to come down to the kind of cockpit that you prefer. For myself, in the simulator at least, I'm more at home in the older style steam cockpit, so I have to say that I like the V-35, and I will probably fly it instead of the G36, but that's just a personal preference. Okay, so we've climbed out of Oshawa, and we are leveling off and turning towards the shores of Lake Ontario. That's the large body of water you see there. And just trying some different power settings here. And one thing I did want to draw your attention to is the very interesting actual engine gauges for the V-35. In particular, the manifold pressure gauge is divided in two. The left-hand side is the usual manifold pressure, but the right-hand side is a fuel flow meter, which actually doubles effectively as a power meter. So the combination of manifold pressure and RPM will generate a certain amount of fuel flow, and if you read the actual aircraft manual, that fuel flow is more or less representative of the power that's going to the engine. So you can actually use the fuel flow meter to effectively set the kind of power level that you want from the engine, and it will be a function of both manifold pressure and RPM. It's not exactly true as you might expect that if you set the manifold pressure, the RPM doesn't affect the power. It does, and you can see how it affects the power by watching the fuel flow gauge. So you can see now with RPM set up around 2,000 RPMs and manifold pressure where it is, we're getting pretty close to what we would call maximum cruise power. If we go much higher than that, we're going to be actually into a high power setting, and actually the gauge is actually divided that way. You can see the lower half of the fuel flow gauge is reserved for sort of a max power setting. So it's an interesting way of calibrating the amount of power that the engine is putting out. So we're over coast to the coast. We're up around 4,000 feet. So let's just start by doing some gentle turns here. First to the left, and the aircraft is smooth, behaves well. Doesn't really need a whole lot of rudder with a gentle left turn. Barely any rudder at all, honestly. It doesn't require a whole lot of effort to convince it to stay in the turn. And then if we steepen the turn a little bit here, it takes a little bit more convincing to stay in the steeper turn. It does need a little bit more rudder. And it does require a fair bit of back pressure. As you can see, we're losing altitude. And so it does require a fair bit of back and forth between bank and elevator to get a level turn. I haven't practiced very much in this particular aircraft, so that wasn't a particularly good level turn. But again, that's not bad. The flight model certainly feels like you have to actually fly the aircraft, which is a good thing. Let's try it back to the right. Yeah, first thing I notice when I go to the right is that I definitely am going to need more rudder going to the right, which is exactly what you would expect. Maybe not quite as much back pressure going to the right. Once again, the aircraft stays in the bank. If we steepen the bank, it feels to me like it wants to go into a steeper bank to the right. Maybe a bit easier than it did to the left. Maybe not quite as much back pressure, not sure. Once again, do need a fair bit of rudder at this bank angle. You can see that's a pretty extreme bank, and it doesn't take a lot of relaxing on the back pressure to suddenly start into a dive either. So again, I'd say that is probably reasonably what one would expect from an aircraft of this type and this vintage. Now, it is worth noting that the Bonanza, the V-tail Bonanza, like the V-35, the Model 35, I guess is the way to describe it. There were several different versions of it. It didn't have a great reputation. In fact, at one point it was known as the Doctor Killer, to sort of imply that it was not kind to amateur pilots who had more money than sense, maybe, when it came to aircraft. So, but let's just do a little bit of a stall here and see just exactly how well it behaves. See whether or not that reputation is well deserved or not. You heard there was a little horn that comes on there. That's a warning. If you reduce power too much with the landing gear up, you will get a warning. So we're not going to go full power off, but we are just going to try and get up to the stall speed, which is around 60 in clean configuration. Keep pulling it back here. And you can, I put the controls back on so you can see how much effort I'm using on the controls. They get pretty mushy down around here, that's for sure. You can hear some noise coming. Hear the sound, the stall horn coming on. We haven't stalled quite yet. And there's the stall there. Well, it does drop a wing fairly dramatically, and the nose also drops, so it's not the most gentle stall in a general aviation aircraft that I have experienced in the sim. So that may be part of the reason that it had the reputation it did. Although, if you read up on the aircraft, the article, for instance, in Wikipedia, is at some pains to point out that when research was done, it was found that there was the incidence of accidents in the Model 35 was no more prevalent than any other model of the Bonanza. So whether or not it really deserved its reputation is an open question. Okay, so next thing we're going to do, we've done the stall behavior, so let's just do a little bit of low-speed flight. Drop the flaps, drop the gear. And we'll just see if we can keep her straight and level. It requires a fair bit of power, almost full power, just to keep straight and level with the gear down and the flaps down. Just doing some turns here. This would be sort of a typical, it's maybe a little bit slow, but sort of a typical approach speed. So just to feel like how it's going to handle when we are in the pattern or on final approach. It is mushy, but it's not unresponsive. Certainly manageable. Alright, so let's put the gear up, let's put the flaps up, and let's head out for our final destination of Toronto, which is, you can see kind of the fishhook coming out from the point of land there just off the right side of the nose. That's Toronto. We can't see the skyline yet. It hasn't drawn in. Okay, so we'll get back up to a moderately high cruise setting here. Again, we're watching that right-hand side of that manifold pressure gauge. And now that we have the engine sorted out, let's actually let's have a little test of the autopilot here. So get more or less straight and level, turn the autopilot on. The autopilot just maintains the attitude you're in when you invoke it. So you can see we're in a little bit of a dive, and we're going to stay diving until I get the, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the altitude control here, about 4,500. So you'll notice that if I try to arm the vertical speed or the altitude mode, because we are already at the altitude that I've set, it's not really picking it up. So what I'm going to have to do is actually set an altitude that's different than what we're at. And just verify it doesn't come on. And that's because basically I have set a set point that we're basically already at. So if I turn the set point down to 35 and press the arm button, now we're going to start going into a dive, and then I pull on the knob, which is really just a right mouse button, and now I get a vertical speed number that I can adjust up and down. So we're starting off at 500, but I can turn it up a little. We can dive a little faster. And that's all pretty simple to use, pretty straightforward, works pretty well. Not a lot of bells and whistles, but it certainly is functional. Okay, the other thing that we can do is use heading mode. So we want to get the heading bug and our current heading so we don't induce a roll as soon as we put it on. And then it's just a matter of turning on heading mode, and as per usual, just steering with the heading bug. And you can see that that works pretty well. And the aircraft is reasonably responsive, but not overly so. So you can see those white buildings just above and to the right of the compass on the dashboard. That's the terminal at the Toronto Island Airport, which is going to be our destination. So we're just working our way towards it. And you can see that the skyline of Toronto has now drawn itself in. And we can vary our vertical speed here now, and also the set point fairly easily with the altitude control here. I'm not exactly sure what to call this panel. The full autopilot is over there beneath the GPS, beneath the Garmin unit, but this little panel right below the nav instruments is obviously the vertical speed panel. And as you can see, I'm just tweaking our approach here, changing our vertical speed, changing our heading. I'm keeping my eye on those white terminal buildings, trying to go for a straight-in approach here. So, not sure what else there is to say about the V-35. As I said, the V-35 is really the model of it was the most common, the most numerous built version of the Model 35, which was the V-tail model of the Bonanza. It was built from 1972 to, I think, the mid-1980s. About 1,300 of the aircraft were built, so it was reasonably common. Chances are, if you run across a V-tail Bonanza, it's more than likely it's going to be a V-35. It was the last model of the Model 35 that was built as well. Now the G36 has been built since then, but it has the T-tail version. And the G36 that we fly in Microsoft Flight Simulator is actually, I believe it's a model that came out in the mid-2000s, so it is a much newer design. But I think that if you flew them side by side, you'd find that their performance is pretty similar. So if you're just looking at performance in terms of what it's going to take to get where you want to go, not a whole lot to choose between the V-35 and the G36. But as I'm sure you will see if you've flown the G36, it's a totally different experience. Okay, I think we can see the runway now. We're getting ourselves lined up here. So one thing to note, the gear down speed for the V-35 is actually about 150 knots. You can put the gear down at a fairly high speed, and you can put the first notch of flaps down at about 140 knots, but you can't put the full landing flaps down until you're in the white zone on the airspeed indicator. So just getting those lined up here. Oops, I'm just trying to adjust the power. Pulling it back just a little bit too far here. Also want to get the RPM, the prop control fully forward, and we'll get the gear down. And we'll get a look at the Toronto skyline there as we line ourselves up on the Toronto Island Airport runway. Toronto Island Airport, also known as Billy Bishop Airport, named after famous Canadian ace of the First World War. Alright, so we're getting lined up. We got one notch of flap down. Eventually we're going to get the second notch of flap down. We want to approach at around 80 knots, and we want to touch down in between 60 and 70. The aircraft handles well on approach. The engine is reasonably responsive. You have to be careful not to get too far behind the power curve. But typical of Continental engines, it really doesn't have a whole lot of lag, not like the big radials do. So we get the second notch of flap down, and we're down to around 80 knots for our final approach here as we fly in front of Toronto Harbour, the Air Canada Centre, and the CN Tower. And we're getting drifting a little bit to the right, come back to the left, keep the speed around 80. It's looking good. No bad behavior on approach. Very pleasant to fly. Of course, because it's tricycle, we'll be able to more or less fly it down to the runway. And we are are down. Welcome to Toronto, everybody. Now, one thing to note with the V-35, the brakes are not particularly strong, so you do need to let the aircraft slow down before you try to brake. And it will require a little bit of rudder dancing to keep it going straight as you apply the brakes, but we did manage to get slowed down in time to make the first taxiway. It's a lovely morning here on the shores of Lake Ontario, and we've arrived in downtown. Maybe we can go find ourselves a nice place for breakfast. So that's going to just about do it for my look at the Carenado Microsoft Beechcraft Bonanza V35 for Microsoft Flight Simulator. And I would say it's another excellent example of Carenado's ability to produce a cheap and cheerful aircraft. It's not the most immersive experience in the world, but it definitely is evocative of this popular and iconic aircraft from the 1970s. The price at $15 is certainly pretty accessible. I'm not sorry that I picked it up. I think that I will probably spend a fair bit of time in it. If steam gauges are your thing, you may want to give it a try. If not, probably not. For now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.